Next, we welcome Dr. Sandy Goldberg on the varieties of religious naturalism.
Thank you very much, Dan. I'm going to try to share my screen. See if this works. Can everyone see that?
Yeah, you're good.
Great. So I will say that first of all, thank you so much to Dan Cederbaum, to the Mordechai Kaplan Center for Jewish Peoplehood, also to the two synagogues, Beth Am Shalom Synagogue, Temple Israel Center, for this really lovely invitation. It's been both an honor and a pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to getting some feedback on this. Rabbi Tucker's presentation was in many ways a nice introduction to the work that I want to do. What I want to do is I want to dig down on the varieties of religious naturalism. It's going to turn out, I think my conception of naturalism is a little bit more expansive than the conception of naturalism that we just heard about. But what I'm going to try to do in this talk is I'm going to try to do two things. I'm going to try to describe the varieties of religious naturalism, and I'm also going to try to evaluate their prospects. I'm not going to be talking about particular Jewish thinkers. Instead, what I'm going to be doing is focusing on the topic of naturalism itself and how copious is this. Then I'm going to break this presentation down into three parts. I'll start with what I'll call the more philosophical part, which is talking about the varieties of naturalism as we encounter them, for example, in contemporary philosophy. Then I'm going to talk about how the varieties of naturalism in contemporary philosophy bears on religious naturalisms. And I'm going to end with a note of Humean humility, a note of humility inspired by the 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume. Let's start with the varieties of naturalism. Naturalism, as I'm going to understand it, is a thesis about the role of science in determining what there is. I'll talk about why it's a thesis about science in a moment. But the crucial point at the outset of this talk is to recognize that if you are a naturalist, you face at least three fundamental choice points in developing your theory. First, you have to say whether your thesis is a thesis in metaphysics or in epistemology. That's a difference that's going to loom very large for me today. Second, you're going to have to say what counts as a science. And third, you're going to have to answer a question that I think many religious naturalists don't attend to with the level of attention that I think it deserves. You have to attend to the question whether it's contemporary present-day science or a completed science that matters. And I'll come back to all three of these in a moment. What I'm going to start with, though, is the idea of naturalism as a metaphysical thesis. And that's the thesis that only natural objects and properties exist. Where does science enter the picture? Well, in our chat, those of you who are following our chat, someone was raising a question about if you identify the natural with all there is, how can there be anything that transcends it? And I think that's a fair question. What's interesting in contemporary philosophy, naturalism is not assumed to be, nature is not assumed to be a category that explains itself. Rather, we try to understand what the natural is in terms of what science tells us. That's a very important point. Natural objects and properties are those, according to this view, studied by the empirical natural sciences. So again, if you're going to develop a view of this kind, you're going to face the other two choice points that I mentioned. One is the demarcation of science. What counts then as an empirical or natural science? And second, are you going to choose contemporary science or completed science as your guide? Okay. Let's start with the demarcation of science. I want to begin very briefly with a comment on why this is a very, very important point. Here's the setup. I want you to imagine that you are standing in front of a room that I'm going to call the reality room. The reality room is a room that is going to contain everything that exists and only those things that exist. And I want you to imagine that you are the arbiter that gets to decide what goes in there. And I want you to imagine that you're facing a whole line of people, each one of whom has one idea of an object or a person that exists. They have one candidate that they want to tell you about. If you think that that object or property exists, you let them go into the reality room. If you think that object or property doesn't exist, you tell them they're not allowed into the reality room. And your task is to determine all and only those people in this line who get to go into the reality room. That's a way of making vivid what naturalism is trying to get at. Naturalism then can be understood as the thesis that when you're making your decision as to what goes into that room, you are going to follow the dictates of science. And in particular, you're going to follow the dictates of scientific theory. You are going to have a list in your hand of all of the things that scientific theory tells you are real or exist. That is, you're going to have a list in your hand of all of the objects and properties that science itself talks about in its fundamental theories. And what you're going to do as a naturalist is allow only those folks into the reality room if the objects and properties they come to you with are on that list. That's the task that you're facing. What that means is that the question of the demarcation of science is a very important one. You have to answer the question, what counts as a science? And here I want to point out, interestingly, that in Rabbi Tucker's view, he appears to have agreed with one very traditional conception within philosophy of what counts as the sciences, namely the physical sciences. The physical sciences, physics, astronomy, chemistry, biology, and paleontology, in the middle and middle of the 20th century, I would say through the 1970s, most philosophers would have told you that when it comes to science, the fundamental sciences are the physical sciences, and nothing counts as a science unless it can be understood in their terms. And if you take that line, you are what I would call an austere metaphysical naturalist. That is, you think that the only real sciences are the physical sciences, and so you will end up making the claim that the only types of objects and properties that exist are those that are mentioned in the physical sciences. Now, that's a little bit stronger than you might actually hold if you're an austere metaphysical naturalist. I want to mention two weakenings, and I have to, with kudos to Rabbi Tucker, he mentioned one of these two. There are two ways you can make this view slightly weaker. One of them, which is the way that Rabbi Tucker mentioned, is to say, well, it's not just the objects and properties that are mentioned in the physical sciences, it's also those that are reducible to those that are mentioned in the physical sciences. That makes your view a little bit weaker. And these days, there's a second way to make your austere view even a little bit weaker, and that is to add the idea that it's not just those objects that are mentioned and properties mentioned in the physical sciences, but also those that supervene on the objects and properties mentioned in the physical sciences. Now, for those of you familiar with philosophy, you will know these terms, reduction and supervenience. It would take me an entire lecture just to tell you what they amount to. I don't have the time to do that. For those of you that are interested, you can ask that in Q&A. For now, I'm going to associate austere metaphysical naturalism with any one of those views, the one that I have right there, or weakening number one, or weakening number two. Now, you might say, wait a second, there's more in our world, surely there's more in our world than what physics, astronomy, chemistry, biology, and paleontology recognize. And in fact, that is a point that philosophers have recognized as well. If you think that's true, you might think that the physical sciences do not exhaust the class of all sciences. You might think, for example, there's such things as the human sciences. You might think they include things like psychology, linguistics, archaeology, and perhaps some others as well. So your conception of what counts as a science includes more than just the physical sciences, it also includes the human sciences. And if you think that that list, the list of physical sciences and human sciences, exhausts the list of all sciences, I'm going to call you a moderate metaphysical naturalist. That view is the view that the only types of objects and properties that exist are those mentioned in the physical and human sciences. And you might even go further. You might think that there's more to science than just the physical sciences and the human sciences. You might think, for example, especially if you remember way back in the days where you were in college, aren't there also the social sciences? Isn't there also sociology, economics, maybe parts of anthropology, and so on and so forth? And you might think, if we're looking to science to tell us what's real, we ought to include the social sciences as well. It's unfair not to include those. And if your conception of science includes not just the physical and social sciences and human sciences, but also the social sciences, I'm going to call you a liberal metaphysical naturalist. Your thesis is that the only types of objects and properties that exist are those mentioned in the physical, human, or social sciences, or those that reduce to them, or those that supervene on them. And I would add, going one step further, that there's a very lively debate in contemporary epistemology, in contemporary philosophy of science, and in contemporary metaphysics about whether that list is exhaustive. In fact, many people say that science is really not the right category. Many people say that the right category is any kind of empirical inquiry that enables us to arrive at warranted or well-justified beliefs about the world. That should be included on this list that we're calling the list of science. And if you think that it does go further than the physical sciences, human sciences, and social sciences, you're likely to think that the list of sciences goes on further, and your conception of naturalism may even be more liberal than what I'm calling liberal metaphysical naturalism. For my purposes, though, the important point is this. If you are a metaphysical naturalist and you confront the choice point that I'm calling demarcation of science, you have at least three options. You can be austere, you can be moderate, and you can be liberal. That brings us to the second choice point, contemporary or completed science. I think this choice point has been deeply underappreciated in the literature on religious naturalism. So I want to dwell a little bit on why I think this is a very important question that has been underappreciated. Let's suppose that you and I agree that we are going to be metaphysical naturalists, and we even agree on the particular sciences that we're going to acknowledge. Let's suppose we agree on liberal metaphysical naturalism. And now we're trying to figure out what list of objects and properties is going to be the list that we use as we decide whether to let people into the reality room. As they come forth with their ideas of what's real and what exists, we have to figure out what goes on our list. Can't we just look at the sciences that we acknowledge? The physical sciences, the human sciences, and the social sciences. Well, wait a second. Do we want to look at the physical sciences and scientific theories as they exist right now? Or do we want to look at the sciences and the scientific theories as they will exist when they are completed and finished? We might say, wait a second, of course we want to use contemporary science. Of course we have to use the science that we have today, not the science that we'll have in the future. After all, you might think it's the best that we have to go on, and we have no idea what science is going to be like in the future. So if what we're trying to figure out is what objects are real, what properties are real, what really exists, we should use contemporary science. But wait a second. You might stop and think for a moment and say, why is that fair? After all, we have lots of evidence that science changes and evolves over time. And when science changes and evolves over time, that can include changes in the very categories that science uses. So for example, there are categories in contemporary science that were unknown to 17th and 18th century scientists. And there were categories from 17th and 18th century science that we no longer use these days. So why, when it comes to what there is, why in the world should we privilege the categories of contemporary scientific theory? On the contrary, we should go with a completed science. If we want to know what there is, and we're naturalists, we should use the list determined by completed science, not contemporary science. As I say, this is a choice point that you face if you're a naturalist. So what this means is that for every metaphysically naturalist theory that we have, for every version that we have, we're going to have two subspecies. If metaphysical naturalism generally is the idea that the only types of objects and properties that exist are those mentioned in science, we have a version that says those that are mentioned in contemporary science, and we have a version that says those that are mentioned in completed science. And what that means for us is that for each one of the views that I mentioned, austere, moderate, and liberal metaphysical naturalism, each one of those varieties breaks down into two different subvarieties, with the result that we have 6 different varieties of metaphysical naturalism. This is which variety is your favorite is going to depend on how you answer the demarcation of science question and how you answer the question whether your guide is contemporary science or completed science. It matters a lot that we have 6 different varieties here, and I'll come back to that. So far, I've only been talking about naturalism as a metaphysical thesis. But I told you really that the first choice point was whether your version of naturalism is a metaphysical thesis or an epistemological thesis. So now let's go to naturalism as an epistemological thesis. This tells us not what there is, but what we're justified in believing there is. So naturalism as an epistemological thesis says we are justified in believing that only natural objects and properties exist. If that's your version of naturalism, you're still going to face the demarcation of science question. Why is that? Well, you think that we're justified in believing that only natural objects and properties exist. But if somebody asks you, well, what objects and properties are natural, you're going to say, well, that's determined by science. And then they're going to say to you, okay, what counts as science? So once again, you have to make decisions about what you are going to count as science. What's interesting about epistemological naturalism, at least where I sit, is that I don't think you face the problem. I don't think you face the choice point of having to choose between contemporary or completed science. And my reason for thinking that is that arguably, when it comes to what's reasonable for us to believe, all we have to go on is our best contemporary science. And that means that if you're an epistemological naturalist, you don't have to face that third choice point. You just can assume that it's contemporary science that's determining what it is that we ought to think exists, that we are justified in believing exists. Okay, because you only have to face one of those two choice points, we only have three versions of epistemological naturalism. And if you put all of this together, what you get is you get 9 varieties of naturalism. 6 as metaphysical naturalism, 3 as epistemological naturalism. Such, I submit to all of you, is the contribution from contemporary philosophy to our understanding of what it is to be a naturalist. As you'll see, it's not obvious what it is to be a naturalist, and you have to make a lot of choices on some very tricky philosophical questions. What does any of this have to do with religion? Well, here's my hypothesis. When it comes to the varieties of religious naturalism, there are as many varieties of religious naturalists as there are naturalists. So you can think of the discussion that I just gave you as providing a framework that enables us to taxonomize varieties of religious naturalism according to the version of naturalism they aim to embrace. Those, of course, include all 9 varieties of naturalism just mentioned. By the way, there may well be more varieties. We're just using 9 for our talk today. What I want to do in the rest of my talk is simply talk about what challenges you face if you are a religious naturalist and you embrace one of those 9 varieties of naturalism that I just described. Let's start with religious naturalists who are metaphysical in orientation. That is, they're metaphysical naturalists. Well, clearly, they can't endorse anything that's inconsistent with what natural science tells us. Of course, they'll have to tell us what natural science is, but that we've already talked about that. That means that if you are a religious naturalist and you believe in metaphysics, your version of naturalism is metaphysical, if you want to believe in God, you've got to understand God accordingly. That is, you've got to understand God in such a way that your conception of God fits onto the list of categories of objects and properties that natural science has given you. We've already seen conceptions of God of this sort. You can, Spinoza, we just saw, repudiated this, but you can imagine someone who thinks that God is to be identified with nature. You can imagine somebody who thinks that God is to be identified with energy. Those are all naturalistically kosher conceptions of God. But what if you fail? What if in conceiving of God, you conceive of God in such a way that belief in God is actually inconsistent with what natural science tells you? Well, if you're a metaphysical naturalist, having done so, it's as if you postulated something that doesn't exist. So as I put in my little note here, in postulating God, it would be as if you're postulating ghosts and goblins. That is what you're worried about if you are a metaphysical naturalist. You're worried about postulating something that doesn't really exist. This means that if you're a metaphysical religious naturalist, let's suppose you think contemporary science is what should guide us in what there is. Contemporary science will then constrain you in how you can understand God. And here's a way to think about that project. Contemporary science, think of all the sciences that you acknowledge. Think of all the theories that are the best theories in those sciences. Those theories will mention types of objects and properties, form a huge list of all of the objects and properties that are mentioned in all those theories, now form an even larger list of the objects and properties that reduce to those, and the objects and properties that supervene on those. Now you've got an even longer list. Your task is to conceive of God in those terms. If your conception of God cannot be made sense of in those terms, you have violated the terms of agreement as a metaphysical naturalist, and it's as if you've postulated something that doesn't exist. You might ask, what though if we are metaphysical naturalists, but we think it's completed science that matters? Here's where some of the action is. How constrained are you if you're a metaphysical naturalist and you believe that it's completed science that ought to tell us what there is? How constrained are you in your conception of God? What I suggest to you is that this depends on how adequate the categories of contemporary science turn out to be. That is, how close they are to those of a completed science. If The completed science uses exactly the categories of contemporary science. There's no difference between these two views. But now imagine the possibility in which we have contemporary science in one way, and as science develops over the hopefully centuries or millennia going forward, science turns out to be very, very different from what we think it is today. This might make you excited as a religious naturalist, as a metaphysical religious naturalist. You might think as follows: I am a naturalist and I'm a metaphysical naturalist, so I think our conception of God has to answer to that list that science gives us. Only that list that science gives us is way off in the future, and we have no idea what's going to be on that list. And in essence, that frees me up to conceive of God however I'd like to. Admittedly, as a naturalist, I'm going to conceive of God in ways that I think will show up on that list, but I have no idea what's going to be on that list. So you might think that if you think it's completed science that ought to tell us what there is, that frees you up. That kind of skepticism about the adequacy of contemporary categories frees you up to have a more expansive conception of God. What I want to point out, though, is that while this does hold the prospect that a commitment to naturalism doesn't strongly constrain you in your conception of God, because after all, we have no idea, according to this view, what's going to be on the completed list, that might look like a virtue of your position. That virtue is purchased at an extremely high price. Because in my view, that virtue is purchased at the price of what I'm calling a general skepticism about our scientific knowledge of the world. Keep in mind that option of opening up your conception of God, because after all, we have no idea what's going to be on a final list of a completed science. That, in a sense, depends on the idea that our contemporary categories are inadequate. But if our contemporary categories are inadequate, they're inadequate to describe the world. And if they're inadequate to describe the world, that's tantamount to saying that science doesn't correctly describe the world, which is a form of skepticism. In short, if you are a metaphysical naturalist and you go with completed science, you face a dilemma. Either you think the categories of contemporary science are adequate, in which case there's no difference between your view and a view of somebody whose guide is contemporary science, or you're going to give rise to what I'm going to call a general form of skepticism about our scientific knowledge of the world. A form of skepticism that I might add is not just skepticism about our current scientific knowledge of the world, but skepticism of our scientific knowledge of the world going forward at any point in time at which we are uncertain about how adequate our contemporary scientific categories are. So I like this because I think this establishes an interesting connection between a possibility for the religious naturalist to end up having more expansive conceptions of God, but turns out to be at the cost of a very general form of skepticism. What about epistemological naturalists? Well, here I'm going to be a little quicker. If you're an epistemological naturalist, you confront a situation which in many respects is like that of the metaphysical naturalist whose guide is contemporary science. So similarly, you're not going to be able to endorse anything inconsistent with what contemporary natural science tells us. And if you want to believe in God, you've got to understand God accordingly. The one big difference is that if you are an epistemological naturalist and you violate the terms of agreement of epistemological naturalism, the result is not that you're going to be accused of postulating something non-existent. The result is that you're going to be accused of an unjustified or unreasonable or irrational belief in God. And this is important because I think this actually opens up some interesting prospects for religious naturalism. Here's the way I would put the prospects. I think there are at least two options that you can take if you want to have God in the picture and you're an epistemological naturalist. Option one is for you to continue to believe in God despite your acknowledged lack of evidence for that belief, in the hope that your belief in God, though unjustified, is nevertheless true. Here I'm just banking on a tradition distinction in philosophy. For me to tell you that your belief is unjustified does not imply that it's false. It just implies that you don't have adequate evidence for it. It can happen that beliefs based on inadequate evidence are true. So option one, go with belief in God, recognizing that the evidence is inadequate in the hope that it's nevertheless true. And if this view strikes you as having some familiarity in some kind of way, I suggest to you that's because this just is the rationale behind what I would call the broadly Christian notion of doxastic faith. Faith, you can think of faith as an attitude that you take towards something like God's existence. When you have that attitude, acknowledging that your evidence isn't sufficient to justify the truth of that proposition. Doxastic faith is when your faith takes the form of a belief. So doxastic faith is just belief in the truth of something where you acknowledge that you don't have adequate evidence. Then you have what I call doxastic faith. But that's not the only option that's open to you if you're an epistemological naturalist who wants God in the picture. There's a second option open to you, and that is to forego belief in the divine entirely and reconceive of Judaism so that a Jewish perspective coheres with our best current scientific understanding of the world. And you might say, wait a second, that doesn't allow God in the picture. How could that allow God in the picture? And I want to say, wait, not so fast. This option is consistent with what I would call non-doxastic forms of faith that God exists. A form of faith that doesn't take the form of a belief. What might that look like? Here's one possibility. Hope that God exists. You might well hope for something that you think you don't have evidence to believe is true. And you might think of that kind of hope, at least when it comes to God, as a kind of faith. I just want to point out that epistemological naturalism is, in fact, consistent with the hope that God exists. All right, so far, I have talked about what kind of challenges you're going to face if you're a naturalist who wants to believe in God. And I talked about the kinds of challenge you're going to face will be a function of which version of naturalism you accept. I now want to conclude, very briefly, with some comments of a Humean variety that I hope will strike you as expressing a certain kind of humility. If I were forced to choose and embrace one of these views, I would choose or embrace liberal epistemological naturalism. That's the closest view to my own intellectual sensibility. I think it's silly to think that science is restricted to the physical sciences. As far as I'm concerned, any well-grounded inquiry into the world, if it yields justified belief, that's good. I'm a liberal in that respect, but I'm also an epistemological naturalist. And I, however, would insist on the importance of reasonable belief throughout our intellectual lives. What that means is that I would embrace option 2 of those 2 options that I just showed you. This forgoes belief in the divine entirely and reconceives of Judaism so that a Jewish perspective coheres with our best scientific understanding of the world. I have it on good authority, namely my wife, that this position is not a particularly attractive one to many people. And I recognize that. So I want to conclude then with one other possibility. This is a possibility, if you like, that I offer to those who are religious naturalists who want to continue to believe in God, who don't particularly like my own proposal. And here I follow David Hume. In dialogues concerning natural religion, Hume distinguished between the following 2 questions. First, if we enter the investigation with no prior religious commitments whatsoever, would the empirical evidence we acquire over the course of our lives rationally support belief in God? He distinguishes that question from the question, if we enter the investigation with a prior commitment to belief in God, would the empirical evidence we acquire over the course of our lives rationally require us to abandon that belief on pain of irrationality? Now, you might think that the answer to these 2 questions should go hand in hand. If the evidence isn't sufficient to support belief in God, then if you come into inquiry with a belief in God, the evidence ought to prompt you to get rid of it. But that wasn't Hume's view. Hume's view was that the answer to the first question is no. The evidence that you encounter is not sufficient to justify or warrant or rationally compel belief in God. But his answer to the second question was also no. It's not sufficient to rationally compel you to give up that belief if you came into the inquiry already having that belief. And you might scratch your head and say, how in the world can you have such a view? That view seems almost inconsistent. After all, if the evidence doesn't support you in forming the belief, how could it not compel you to give the belief up? And the answer is that in taking a negative approach to both questions, Hume appears to having been assuming a version of what these days we call epistemic permissivism. Epistemic permissivism holds there can be rational disagreements about what the evidence supports. Hume's view appears to be that what the evidence supports can depend on what your prior commitments are. And if that's right, we have the following Hume-inspired idea. You might endorse a version of epistemological naturalism and treat your belief in God as a prior commitment. After all, Hume taught us that there's nothing incoherent, there's nothing irrational about doing so. Is this a way out? Well, it is, but it's not one that I like, and this is the last point I'm making. The reason I don't like this is because this maneuver strikes me as exhibiting a kind of intellectual defensiveness that, for my part, I don't find attractive. At the same time, I've got to acknowledge, my own desire to avoid being intellectually defensive on this point is not itself an adequate defense of my own position. And so I leave all of you with the task of assessing the various positions I've described. That is your take-home homework assignment for the day. And with that, I thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Sandy. That was extremely provocative. I can't resist commenting quickly that I think the view you characterized as your own personal view that your wife doesn't like is the view that Kaplan had to spend a fair amount of time claiming was not his view because people said it was, which I find fascinating.